Hi guys, welcome to this video on river management and flood mitigation. In this video we're going to look a little bit about how rivers behave during floods and some of the things that humans can do to protect themselves against flood-related damages and mitigate those damages. So in this video we'll look at how rivers naturally meander and how they naturally interact with their floodplain as part of the flooding process. Then we'll look at a few different strategies to manage channel bank erosion and some of the pros and cons of trying to manage bank erosion during floods. And then we'll finish with a brief look at flood zoning and the use of dams to control flood discharge. So although inundation is a big factor in flooding, one of the most destructive aspects of flooding is actually adjustment of channel geometry during the high discharges that are associated with flooding. So here's a river in Vermont after Hurricane Irene. Obviously the channel was over here at one point. During that high discharge during the flood, it eroded laterally and consumed a bunch of this road, a very costly channel adjustment, but of course a natural channel adjustment. So this is the problem. Humans have built roads within the zone where the river expects to be able to move around. So we really need to understand how that river is moving around and why, to understand where we can safely build our infrastructure. So one of the core ideas is that river channels meander naturally. Not all channels do this, but many do. They tend to develop curves or bends, usually arising from some random perturbation. And as that bend develops, velocity of the water ends up being higher around the outside of the curve, which then moves sediment and maintains a deeper, higher velocity channel on the outside of the curve, and we get a lot lower velocities on the inside. And you can see that velocity profile here. So the result over time is that those higher velocities on the outside tend to erode the outer bank of a turn, and that's called a cut bank. It's literally an oversteepened channel wall on the outside of the turn, and material that is eroded from that cut bank tends to actually be deposited on the inside of the turn in what's called a point bar. So we often see these cut banks and point bars paired together, where sediment's being mined off of the cut bank and then deposited on the point bar. And of course, as this process happens, as you erode this outer bank, the channel is actually migrating. So this is how channels are actually able to move back and forth across a valley. They erode that leading outer bank and deposit the material on the inner bank on the point bar. So this happens and channels move naturally. Here's an example of what that looks like. Here's a cut bank that's recently collapsed. The way this often will happen is that the river currents will actually undermine. They'll actually erode material from the base of the bank, which then causes the upper part to be unstable and collapse into the river, and the river can then move that material as well. Of course, depositing some of it on its growing point bar on the inside of the turn. So what happens over time as this channel continues to migrate outward, eroding its cut bank? Eventually, the path taken by that meandering river will become too long and circuitous, and it will be cut off, creating what's called a cut-off meander bend. So you can see the Owens River here once flowed like this and actually took this meander bend all the way around out here. Then, probably during a flood event, floodwaters came roaring through and decided it was far more direct to go over the floodplain and bypass that cut-off meander bend. And now once the floodwaters start roaring across here, they're quickly able to erode a new, more direct channel. And then when the floodwaters recede, that direct channel remains as the main channel of the river. And the meander bend has literally been cut off. So this meander bend is now abandoned. It's basically a little backwater pond, and it's eventually going to fill with sediment and just become part of the landscape. So if this process of meander migration and meander cutoff continues over millions of years, we end up with what's called a meander belt. And we can see an example of that here, taken from space, of the Rio Negro in Argentina. So here's the active river, and what we see are traces of the ancient channel all throughout the landscape. And many of these obviously are cut off meander bends. They're places where a flood ended up carving a new, more direct channel and cutting off the meander bend. But what's really important about these meander belts is that they show us everywhere the river has been over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And so they provide a geological record of what kind of river migration is possible, and they also provide a record or a map of where the active migration corridor is. So we'll often call this a meander belt corridor or a migration corridor. So obviously, if you want to think about smart planning and development around rivers, it's generally wise to stay out of the migration corridor where you know the channel could be migrating back and forth over timescales of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. Now, of course, in many cases, humans have actually built well within the meander migration corridor. And so humans spend a lot of time trying to prevent rivers from cutting across their floodplains and from cutting new channels that circumvent meander bends. And here's an example of that from the White River in Vermont after Hurricane Irene. So this is part of a meander bend on the river here. It goes like this. And during the floodwaters came ripping through here and flowed over the floodplain and then rejoined the main river down here. And you can see in this case, a new channel was not created. The water never became focused enough and had enough energy to actually erode this material and carve a new channel. Instead, it just draped material onto the floodplain. However, if it had coalesced a little deeper flow, it may well have carved a new channel through here, which of course would have been disastrous for this farmer and his field. Now, one management practice to prevent this kind of channel evulsion is called a vegetation buffer. And that's the idea of planting a nice belt of forest between your floodplain and the river. So here's the floodplain, here's the river, here's the vegetation buffer. The idea there is that during big floods, as water enters or exits the floodplain, these trees and vegetation are there to slow the velocity down so that you do not develop high energy and ultimately develop erosion and channelization on your floodplain. So the vegetation buffer slows down floodwaters and prevents channelization. Another way to prevent evulsion onto the floodplain during floods is levees. So this is a management practice where humans build basically earthen embankments along the bank of a river and basically artificially raise the height of the channel bank such that the water will just flow between the levee banks, and even during flood stages it won't flood onto the floodplain. So although this can be helpful to prevent meander migration and meander cutoff, of course it's also very damaging because it cuts floodplains off from their rivers. And we've learned in previous videos that these floodplains act as important storage reservoirs for floodwaters. So if you cut them off with a levee, those floodwaters go directly downstream, where they might make flooding more intense downstream. So levees can prevent evulsion, but they lead to more intense flooding downstream. So to summarize some of these concepts, I want to show you this beautiful LiDAR image of the Willamette River in Oregon. So this is a very high resolution topography that's been shaded here in different colors of white and blue, which may correspond to elevation or perhaps to roughness. In any event, you can see a couple beautiful things. Here's a really nice meander belt. You can see the active river is here, but we can see that it's been meandering all over the place, probably over the last hundreds of thousands of years. Further downstream, we see some beautiful floodplain evulsion channels, where during flood events, the river hopped its banks and carved these evulsion channels across the floodplain. Of course, that didn't totally lead to meander cutoff because the river's still flowing around here, but we do see where those floodwaters were cutting across the floodplain. All right, so now that we've looked at meanders and floodplains a little bit, let's look more specifically at how humans manage channel bank erosion. So in addition to kind of causing these evulsions we've been talking about, floods often cause lateral channel migration. Quite simply, a channel that might have been restrained over here during a flood erodes laterally and the channel becomes wider. So why do they do this? Well, what rivers are really doing is they're dumping their excess energy. During a flood, they have way more energy than they know what to do with, and lateral erosion is a very effective way to get rid of this energy. So first of all, you have to move the sediments, so that dumps some of your energy. But also, you end up with a wider channel, which has a lower hydraulic radius, which means more friction, which means the water goes slower. So what the river's really saying is, wow, I've got too much discharge. I've got to make myself a bigger channel that has more friction per unit area so that next time there's a flood, the floodwaters are going to go a little bit slower through this reach because the channel is wider. Now, of course, humans can't handle this. We don't want rivers moving laterally because it destroys roads and buildings. So, enter the idea of bank stabilization, also sometimes called channelization. What we as humans can do is bring in something, for example, called riprap, large rocks or blocks of concrete, material that is strong and big enough that the river can't move it. We're going to armor the banks of the river with this material, and next time there's a flood, the river will not be able to erode laterally, and it will be contained within its existing channel. Okay? So it's quite common we'll place this material on the outside of a bend, as shown by these circles here, so that during a flood, keep in mind the deepest, fastest water is on the outside, so that energy will be right up against the riprap, and there will not be any erosion. So this stuff's great. It prevents channel migration during floods, so mission accomplished for sure, but there's a couple side effects, which we'll call cons or drawbacks of bank stabilization. One is that they promote worse flooding downstream, and the other is that they destroy habitat for aquatic species, like fish. And we're going to look closely at both of these drawbacks now. So why does bank stabilization promote intense downstream flooding? Well, it prevents rivers from doing exactly what we just talked about. It prevents them from expending their energy on the erosion of the bank and sediment transport. So they've got nothing to erode, nothing to move, so they just pass that energy right downstream into the next downstream reach. Likewise, bank stabilization forces rivers into narrower, deeper channels, which tend to have larger hydraulic radii, which have less friction to consume the river's energy. So instead of being able to spread the river out across a wider area with more friction, we force the river into a narrow, confined channel, which tends to have a lot less friction. So many times channelized rivers are designed to conduct water very efficiently. Got a nice kind of rectangular channel here, should move water really quickly downstream. And obviously no lateral erosion here. Now that's fantastic, that's great, except in many cases when that water doesn't have a chance to dump the energy, it just gets going too fast, and that energy is going to get dumped into the next reach downstream. So in many engineered channels, it's common to actually add roughness elements. Notice these rough blocks and rough blocks along the edges. This is deliberately not perfectly smooth so that it will slow floodwaters during floods. And then here's the punchline of all this. As I've already said, if you do stabilize a bank upstream, it may pass that energy downstream and cause more intense erosion downstream, as we're seeing in this picture here. So the second drawback of bank stabilization or channelization is that habitat can be destroyed. And so let's look quickly at what habitat elements are important in a river and how they get destroyed. So things like tree cover are really important for keeping the water shaded and cool. Woody debris in the channel helps to create cold, deep pools for fish. So here we see some of these big logs are creating some nice shaded, deep, quiet pools where fish love to hang out and beat the heat. Likewise, in general, natural channels just tend to develop slow, deep pools, even without woody debris. And then we've got a mixture of sediment sizes, where eggs or juvenile aquatic species can hang out and grow. So if we look at a channelized river, you're basically lacking all of these elements, okay? You've got no tree cover, you've got no woody debris, you've got no pools. You probably have a very homogeneous sediment size in here, since the current is the same strength everywhere. So you don't have a lot of nice microhabitat of different sediment sizes. Everything's very homogeneous and open. It's a terrible place for fish to live and survive. So that's one of the drawbacks of channelization. All right, so let's wind this video down looking at a couple of other ways humans try to protect themselves from floods. We'll look at flood zoning, and then we'll finish with the idea of dam control. So flood zoning is the idea that federal government or state governments can place regulations on where it's okay to build houses and commercial buildings. And the idea is that, let me just first say, most of these regulations are very dialed into looking at flood inundation. They're trying to avoid buildings being inundated with water on the floodplain. Only recently have these regulations started to really consider a channel migration corridor. How close should you be able to be to the active channel given its likelihood of migration? Okay, so these are kind of different risks, inundation versus channel migration, and most regulations really focus on the flood inundation piece. So as an example, FEMA guidelines say no building at all within the 20-year recurrence footprint. So that's the area of the floodplain that would be inundated during the 20-year recurrence flood. And then only flood reinforced buildings within the 100-year footprint. So you can build, but you have to meet a special building code if you want to be within the 100-year floodplain. So that's all sensible. To hit that home a little bit, let's look at what that means for our hometown of Middlebury, Vermont. Here is downtown Middlebury, right here. And the college is right up here on the hill. And this is Frog Hollow and Storm Cafe right down here. So you can see that anything in zone A7 is forbidden to build in, and anything in zone B is restricted building. So luckily in Middlebury, we have a pretty restricted floodplain. And we've already talked about why that is a bit. We don't tend to get big floods, which means we can actually build pretty darn close up to the river level. So I'll just finish with the idea of flood control dams. So in many cases, people are not willing or able to deal with the hazard of either inundation or channel migration during a flood. Basically, there's too much human infrastructure downstream, and flooding is not acceptable. So in those cases, it's common to use upstream dams to control flooding. So these will often be built in the headwaters of rivers with the intention of, well, both making electricity sometimes, but also being able to act as a flow regulator. During times of especially high discharge, you can store water behind the dam and then let it out slowly so you don't get a peak of downstream flooding. So that's fantastic. Of course, dams aren't perfect. They interrupt fish migration. They also happen to inundate a large portion of what might have been an interesting landscape. So that's kind of a drawback. But they do have an impact. And here's an example of the flood control dams on the Connecticut River. So this is Long Island Sound down here. We got Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Here's the larger Connecticut River watershed, and here are the flood control dams in black, both on the main stem of the Connecticut, but also on the tributary rivers. And you can see there's quite a few of them, and what this plot really shows is that the size of the 10, 5, and 2-year recurrent flood events has dropped considerably since these flood control dams were installed. So for example, the size of the 10-year flood event has dropped by 70%, or 50 to 70% in many of these cases. So basically, these dams have the effect of wiping out those larger flood events. That's great for people, but it may not always be great for the health of a river channel, which sometimes rely on large flood events to freshen and maintain habitat. And finally, dams have a shortcoming. They're temporary. Eventually, dams fill with sediment, they lose their ability to store water, and then they have to be decommissioned or blown up. Which, of course, when you blow up a dam that's filled with sediment behind it, you have some very intense downstream impacts as that sediment makes its way down the stream in a huge pulse. And this is starting to happen nationwide. Dams are starting to be decommissioned, and we're just understanding what the effects of that sediment pulse is. Great example of this is the Matilija Dam on the Ventura River in California. Built in 1947, lasted only about 65 years before it was basically full. And now it's going to have to be decommissioned. So dams, in retrospect, maybe were not as useful and didn't have the same longevity that we had hoped when they were first built in the early part of the 1900s. So in summary, how can we mitigate or manage the effects of flooding on human infrastructure? Well, we can really divide these into two approaches or two camps. One that might be soft approaches that often are favored by geomorphologists and might have better results in the long term. And then we can think of hard approaches that might often be favored by civil engineers or town select boards. So soft approaches to mitigate flooding would be to allow rivers to migrate and to erode their banks. We know that when they do this, they create a natural channel geometry that allows them to dump more of their energy more effectively and reduce the intensity of downstream flooding. Likewise, if we allow them to stay connected to their floodplains, we know those floodplains can temporarily store water, which can diminish the intensity of downstream flooding. Contrast that against the hard approaches, things like installing riprap to stabilize banks and channelize rivers, which can be helpful in the short term but can have downstream effects. And then, of course, building flood control dams, which is effective but is super invasive and potentially a short-lived solution. So I'll leave you with these concept questions. You can tackle these on the quiz, which is linked below this YouTube video. Thanks, and see you in class.